Hello, this is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American, and I'm here today to talk about hope. Today, we are, as part of our season that is focusing on finding agency, we're going to talk about stress and trauma. Now, in this show, we're going to talk about the many different effects that trauma can have on your life, the different types of trauma, including PTSD as part of that. We're also going to talk about the traumas that Dr. Bashah and I have both been involved with. And as we wrote our book, Addictive Ideologies, the people that we interviewed that had incredible traumas that were involved in Holocausts or the victims of extremist movements. What you're going to find as you listen to this show will not only be the effects of trauma, but you're going to hear about the gold standard in psychology and how it is that psychologists are dealing with this. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the 7 things that you can do individually for yourself that relate to the hierarchy of agency that you can find on our website to be able to treat trauma on your own. And that doesn't mean that we always recommend that you doing it. And last, if you wait all the way to the end of the show, you'll hear us talk about the issue of forgiveness. And that's a controversial item. And you might be surprised to see which one of us is advocating for forgiveness and which one of us thinks that while forgiveness may be important, it's not essential. Anyway, this is Paul Johnson. I'm here with Dr. Emily Bashah. Welcome to the show. Well, Dr. Bashah, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so today we're going to talk about trauma. And what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the types of trauma that exist, the effects that it can have on a person. We're going to talk about ways in which psychologists actually treat it, but then we're going to talk about ways that people can self-treat trauma, things that you can do yourself that you and I have worked on in our hierarchy of agency in the Optimistic American. So let's start with this. Both of us have been involved with lots of different people with trauma, people in our families, certainly. You have been a psychologist. You treat people with trauma on a constant basis. You've dealt with people not only trauma, but with PTSD. I've dealt with people who've had trauma. I always, when I talk to people, ask them what their story is, what their challenges are, how they overcame those challenges. And oftentimes, when you're listening to those challenges, it is in effect trauma. It's a trauma that they suffered. And that's a question I have asked literally thousands of people. I've mentored hundreds of people. And then both of us wrote the book Addictive Ideologies. And in Addictive Ideologies, one of the things that we did as part of our work was that we began questioning people who had been through genocides or through the Holocaust, or people who had been victims of terror or, for that matter, extreme violent acts. And what we began to find was that there are some patterns that exist. So if you would, help me first try to identify or help people understand what trauma actually is.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of people will talk about, well, my trauma, and this was a traumatic experience, breaking up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So the way that we define trauma is different from diagnosing it. So we may use it in terms in our everyday language, but to actually meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, there has to be functional impairments in one's personal life and one's work and their relationship and their education. So we need to see impairments across the board. So the first criteria is that they have to have at least witnessed or experienced a life-threatening event. This can sometimes include secondary trauma. So first responders who come to scenes or maybe are exposed to secondary traumatic material, say if it's like forensic evidence or things like that, that could also be considered enough criteria. Sexual violence has also been included as part of the criteria. So then the other symptoms that follow from that would be things like hyperarousal, avoidance, alterations in cognitions and mood, and I'm going to describe what some of these are, and intrusive stimuli or re-experiencing of symptoms. So some of the common symptoms might be somebody's having flashbacks when they're not intentionally thinking about the incident. They'll just be minding their own business, having a conversation with somebody, and then all of a sudden they get a flashback. Sometimes things can remind them, so things that like smell or taste or touch or temperature, anything visually may be enough to remind them of some of the events, something that somebody says to them. So all these things could be what are called triggers for these flashbacks. Intense, severe nightmares that's impairing their sleep and they're having sleep disturbances. The other things are maybe they're on edge all the time, agitated, a bit aggressive, hard to deal with. They may have a quick startle response. So somebody who hears a noise and they're constantly jumpy. So some of those are all linked to trauma symptoms. Exaggerations in cognitions and mood, that could be like that paranoia, extreme fear, intense anxiety, where they see the world as a threatening, hostile place because of their experiences, even with passage of time and reality testing, that they're still not finding a balance. They're still on that edge.
All right, so again, we've both dealt with lots of different people, and I want to try to create a little bit of a separation so I can understand this. I've spoken to, and you've spoken to people whose children were murdered in front of them, people who lost their parents who were murdered and tortured. We've spoken to people who've been raped or who have been the victim of child abuse. Now, my question is, sometimes that trauma happens in one incident, but sometimes it happens over long periods of time. I know I had police officers who worked for us that sometimes would work inside neighborhoods where literally you could hear shootings happening every single night. They knew they were walking into situations that were going to be tense on almost every single encounter, where people would be angry with them. Military people, you'll hear the same story. They knew that they had to be alert every single moment because at any point that they could be shot or they could be harmed. One of those tends to be a PTSD. The other is a trauma from a single event. How do you really distinguish between those and all of those effects that you just spoke about?
Yeah. So there's something called compounded trauma, and absolutely in the forensic work that I do, it's not uncommon to see that there are compounded forms of losses and traumas. So exposure to violence, whether it's domestic violence or community violence, gang violence, and things that are happening inside of the household, whether there's exposure to substance use, or that there's extreme physical abuse of a person within the household or the person I'm evaluating. And then that just becomes a repeated pattern in their life because now that's the only life that they know and they're familiar with. And so what tends to happen, I mean, it's not uncommon, I see this pattern all the time, is they really gravitate towards that lifestyle because it's so familiar to them. It's what they know. And so that's when you start to see compounded trauma. So it's not uncommon to hear people say, well, lots of family members were brutally murdered or killed, or my best friend died, or that there were multiple suicides of my friends, whether it was by overdoses or shooting themselves. And that becomes a common story. And so what happens is a person just becomes detached or desensitized to violence because their system, their body, and their emotional reactivity, and also their brain, it can't handle this overload. And so it learns just to shut down and not process things in a similar way, so that they're just totally detached. It's not uncommon to see things like dissociation or depersonalization, where a person really is outside of their body or almost watching their life as though it was a movie, don't really feel connected to their life in any way. This can impair identity.
Yeah, we had a police officer once, I remember, on a run. He had just come back from a tour in Afghanistan. He had served in the reserves, and they called him up. And I remember during this run, a car backfired and he literally dove on the ground. So the question, it's interesting to note that you say that they become more accustomed to it, but yet they can also become more sensitive to it, more sensitive to believing that it still exists, that the challenge is still there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, part of it is survival. So I'm just imagining like first responders, or I mean, if you go to Israel, I think that whole place has PTSD. I mean, a whole country could probably be diagnosed as having PTSD because everybody's got a trauma story.
And they're constantly dealing with violence. They're constantly dealing with bombings and rockets, and knowing that they're threatened by outside forces. And that, I think you're right. I think the whole country is kind of in almost a traumatic state.
So the threat to survival is constantly there. It's not just something that's in your mind. And so if that's the case, usually in treating PTSD is you really want to stabilize the situation, minimize the crisis. The person has to be safe. You can't try and treat traumatic symptoms of somebody still in a domestic violence relationship. They have to be in a safe, stable place in order to see probably a natural diminishment of those symptoms. But if they're in that threat environment, then that anxiety and fear is there for a reason, and it's justified. It's legitimate.
All right. That before we get to treatment, that brings me to the brain. Mm-hmm. What's going on inside the brain itself when these types of stresses take place? I mean, I know that I've heard it explained that there's a primitive portion of the brain, and the primitive portion of the brain is used to dealing with fight, flight, defend, or freeze, whereas the cortex is a portion of the brain that developed later from an evolutionary standpoint. And while it is the place
the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, but but it's kind of the human portion of us. It's the part that makes us human beings, because we have the ability to be optimistic. We have the ability to think about thinking. We have the ability to love. We find the ability to create and to innovate. But the more reptilian portion of the brain, which is designed to deal with threats, overpowers that cortex because it needs to, because it's important for it to. Maybe if you can help us understand what actually is going on neurologically.
So there's some research looking at brain development, say from childhood. So if a child is exposed to an excessive amount of violence and exposure to trauma, and there hasn't really been an opportunity for that person to experience safety, security, attachment, that there can be structural changes to the brain. The brain will physically look different. So then on top of that, the mechanisms of action within the brain also can change. Now, the brain has plasticity, meaning that it can adapt over time. And this is where we're finding treatment and interventions can actually help heal the brain. But it takes time, and you're having to use different parts of the brain and learn to emotionally regulate and help to rebuild, reconstruct memory. So the areas of impairments that are most notably seen as being affected by compounded trauma is the amygdala, which is what you were talking about, that primitive part of the limbic system in the brain. And so that's where the seat of fear and emotion is. So the fight, flight, freeze response would be activated by that. We also see the prefrontal cortex, which is what you described also, is being affected. And so that helps to regulate behaviors or inhibit certain behaviors. So you're going to see people more impulsive. And that's an effect of brain injury or brain damage. And the other part of the brain is the hippocampus, and that's where the seat of memory is. And so you'll see like impaired memory or fragmented memory, and seeing how trauma affects memory. So there's a lot that can be damaged as a result, but can also be healed and repaired with
All right.
treatment.
So let's talk about treatment. And maybe we could just start by talking about treatment for trauma and then move to how it might differ if you're treating someone with PTSD.
Yeah, so trauma as opposed to PTSD. So somebody may say, this breakup with a partner that I had was a traumatic experience. Well, okay, I don't want to minimize that person's experience, but it doesn't necessarily meet criteria for PTSD. But something happened to them that they're feeling like this was significant. And so it may be a loss that they feel in their life, that they feel like their reality is totally distorted in the life that they once knew, or maybe it's a divorce.
I love one of the things that Dr. Assad told us. Dr. Assad, who was on our show and actually had been in a prisoner of war camp inside of Bosnia. He was slated to be killed. He was tortured. His friends were killed. He went through incredible trauma. And I asked him the question. I said, gosh, it kind of puts my trauma and other people's trauma in perspective. And he says, no, you can't do that. He said, all traumas to the individuals are still traumas, and you have to treat them as traumas.
Yeah, and what he's saying is there's no hierarchy of trauma. Like, don't compare one's trauma as better than or worse than or more severe or less severe. It really depends on how it's impacting the individual. And I definitely agree with that. But we also have defined definitions of how we diagnose and treat PTSD. So that's different. But if somebody is going through a divorce and they feel like, oh, this is such a traumatic experience for me, what's really happening is there's adaptation that they're going through. They're having to adapt a different life than the one that they thought and believed in would have continuity. And when that shift happens, it can be a challenge to identity, and it also hits attachment and a sense of, well, who will love me, or am I lovable? And so all these other questions can come up and be devastating in a person's life, but over time, those things will be reconstructed, and it will be a different life. It won't be the same life. You may not be the same person, nor would you necessarily want to be the same person. The same thing happens with death or loss. And those things do impact us by what we experienced. But we also learn from it, we grow from it, and we can heal from it if we allow ourselves to. The problem I see is where people remain stuck. And they're constantly going back, whether they're blaming their perpetrators for ruining their life. If a horrific, say a woman was raped when she was in early adulthood or maybe even in adolescence, and say in adulthood she's really having a hard time connecting with people and having intimacy, and sex is a trigger for her. Because she's constantly re-experiencing some of those symptoms. And so that's where the problems would be, the functional impairments that I was talking about earlier. And so I would really want to be working closely with this person, like, what are their cognitions? What are their interpretations of the rape that had happened to them that is impairing their ability to experience intimacy?
I would assume the trauma, this is interesting to me, I would assume that the trauma, they didn't impose it upon themselves. Somebody imposed the trauma on them. It was something that took place that they had no control over.
Yeah.
And so in that respect,
truly victimized.
They were truly victimized. What I wonder is there ever a desire by the person who's going through that trauma that stays with them to hang on to it, where it gives them any satisfaction to know that it's still there, or maybe not satisfaction. I'm not quite sure of what the right word is, but they hang on to it from a survival standpoint.
Yeah, and it's complex. My understanding is that it starts to become enmeshed with their identity. When I see people really holding on to the trauma, and there's something that it gives them, whether it's an opportunity to blame others, and really not allow themselves to feel empowered. And it may give them an out if they're really fed up with life and not wanting to really engage in it. And so it depends on the narrative. If I was working with a person like that, I would really want to see and understand, like, how is it serving you to constantly blame the system or the patriarchy or your parents or the family or your community for not protecting you when you were a child, and they should have. And now that you're a grown adult and still talking as though it was happening yesterday, what is the function of that? How is that serving you? How is that helping you?
That has to be a hard question, because it borders on this line of, no, wait a minute, I'm the victim. You can't be blaming me for the trauma that I experienced. But yet sometimes it does service people. I mean, failure actually has an emotional impact on you. When you fail at something, we know that it has a psychological effect on the brain. And we know that in that the feeling can almost be like you're beaten up. When you begin to find that you've lost at something, that you didn't get the job that you wanted, or you weren't promoted, or you're not good at, you feel like you're not good at lovemaking, or you've lost a spouse, or you've lost someone who decided to leave you and to abandon you, that can actually feel physical. It can feel like you've been beaten up and like you've been harmed. Sometimes having an excuse for that,
it's self-protective.
It's protection. So if you know that something happened bad to you, and you can say, hey, I'm not able to hold on to a relationship because of this bad thing that happened to me. It gives you an excuse. You don't feel as bad about it, but yet it also becomes much more difficult to solve the problem.
You can't get out because you stay trapped in it. So I think you're on it, Paul. I think that there is some kind of self-preservation that is going on for people to remain stuck in their trauma narrative and not see a way out. And maybe even if they see a way out, there is a helplessness or a powerlessness because they may not inherently believe it's true, that they can get out of it. But also, some of the other things that may disempower them is that they're stuck in this hopelessness, that there's something so destroyed inherently within them that they don't necessarily believe that it's even possible. So why try? So that would be some of the self-defeating attitudes.
Self-sabotage.
Yeah. Another example I was thinking of is maybe it's an out in that they don't have to have the responsibility to heal themselves. Healing involves self-love. And if a person despises themselves or sees themselves as unlovable, as ugly, as discarded by society.
And I think oftentimes that feeling, though, may come in a different form. It may come in the form of shame.
Shame and guilt is also addictive. And maybe what you're saying is there may be comfort in feeling and allowing yourself to be immersed in that shame and guilt because it's familiar.
Because you know it. It's dependable. You can count on it.
Yes.
It's going to be there. You can't count on the other person to not leave you. You can't count on keeping the job that you have. But you can count on that pain being there. And you can count on the ability to have something that's reliably, and I'm going to call it an excuse, but maybe it's a defense is a better word. All right, so
So the challenge, I was just thinking about this in terms of treatment. Like, I don't want to just
That's where I
bring up
wanted to go.
all the problems and
Yes.
then say, okay,
Good luck.
you're screwed. No, we don't want to do that. So I want to bring in the light to the darkness here. Sometimes it's hard to see where it exists, but it does. That there is a transience that happens. A person, and I see this all the time in therapy, that there'll be this ebb and this flow. They may stay stuck and they're going to dig their heels in the ground and they're going to say, no, I'm powerless. I'm going to stay in the darkness and the shame and the guilt forever because this is what I know, and why should I even bother trying or believe that there is some other possibility for me, because that just seems so impossible. But then there'll be a shift and they'll do something a little bit different than they're used to. And that they'll start to feel like, oh, maybe this is possible for me. Maybe this could be possible for me. And there'll be some, now when people catch themselves in it, it can be more empowering because they could see that the life could be different for themselves. And when they start to think differently, when they start to feel differently, when they start to do things differently, that's when they can start to develop some of these other patterns. And that's the path towards healing. As I was saying before, the brain has plasticity, and the neural networks and the wiring of the brain can shift, but it has to be reconstructed.
That's fascinating because that's the same process I go through with employees and with people I mentor, which is, how do you motivate people? Now, I believe you have to kind of come self-equipped with the energy to be able to get the job done. But motivation is a fascinating thing because it's caused by, there are three basic elements to motivation. The first element is you have to challenge yourself, right? The second thing is you have to have someone who will encourage you, that says, hey, we're getting there, right? Because along the way, you don't at first see the growth. It's not there. But when you get done, you have to see the growth and be able to measure it. And when you can see those three things, you took the challenge, someone helped inspire you along the way, and you found motivation, you can find the motivation to get something done. And you're talking about the same thing happens in dealing with trauma. It's sometimes once you can get just a little piece of an advancement, they begin to see how they can gain a different life. And that starts to give you the motivation. So before we get to how you can self-treat, let's talk about how you as a psychologist might treat PTSD or trauma.
So the gold standard of the approach right now is trauma-informed treatment. There are other modalities that have been proven to be very effective, which is like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for trauma, as well as cognitive reprocessing. And there are some different narrative therapies that have been used in reprocessing one's trauma story, so their interpretation of what they're telling themselves about what has happened is modified. So with trauma-informed treatment, what I would look for is, where are the problems really permeating and creating more of like a prioritization. If this person is not sleeping and they're having to drink excessive amounts of alcohol or abuse sleeping medications, that's probably going to be one of the first areas that I really want to start looking at. Is this person self-medicating in a way that's impairing them? And if alcoholism or substance use or medication abuse is happening, which is so common, especially with PTSD, then that's something that needs to be treated really right away, needs to be prioritized. So looking at their health, their well-being, some of their habits. If they're aggressive and prone to violence and having impulse control problems, that's also another commonality. So I would look at also safety issues and seeing like what are the risks that are there in this person's life that also needs to be prioritized and addressed. So working from that model, that the belief is not all trauma is bad or needs to necessarily be fixed. People can live very healthy, functional lives that are very fulfilling and purposeful and meaningful without really needing to go in for therapy. Those people have done a lot of work on their own. Oftentimes they're really connected to communities or other people that they have been able to really reprocess their trauma or even share their experiences with, and have really developed a sense of meaning from their trauma. So we call that post-traumatic growth. And if you can transform the trauma and make it part of your personal resilience, your story of resilience, your story of strength. This is where adversity that you've overcome, and this helps you in your life and in shaping your identity, then that's a strength. That's you've done the work to get there. This is where we want to move people.
All right, so I want to give you a story, and I'd love to just hear your thoughts about how you would treat this person. So a long time ago, again, I was the mayor, and during the time I was the mayor, there was a very violent gang called the Crips and the Bloods, or two gangs that were called the Crips and the Bloods. They were oftentimes at war with one another. Yeah. They were very, very violent and very much into drug trade. Mm-hmm. We went on a drug bust one night where I think it was 80 homes, whatever it was a number of homes that we broke into at the exact same time on the exact same hour because that's what the warrant allowed us to do. I convinced the police chief to allow me to suit up and to be the third person through the door. There were a lot of people who thought the police chief wanted me to die, which could have been true, but actually I had to twist his arm to get him to do it. It was, it was almost a chain of command type of thing. But we got to the home. People surrounded the house, or a person by each window. There was a person on the right and left side of the door. I was two people back. And they pounded through the door with the big sledgehammer that they had. And when they went through, the first guy went one direction, the other guy went another direction. And then the person in front of me went in, and then I went in behind him. People were running around. There were shots that were fired. One guy ran down the bathroom towards the bathroom, flushed the drugs down the toilet. The police officers fired no shots. They just basically jumped on people, arrested them. It was an incredible amount of violence happening. The thing that caught my attention is in the middle of the floor, in the living room, was a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Mm-hmm. He'd just woken up. It was early in the morning. His legs were crossed. He never moved. His eyes didn't get big. He didn't cry. He didn't get upset. He didn't hide. Mm-hmm. He just sat there and watched all this violence going on. I couldn't help but pick him up, right? I couldn't help but try to think about what was going on with him. And I got his name, and I don't want to give his name, but I tracked him over the years, mm-hmm. and he's been in and out of jail. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, I mean, this is a kid who was growing up in an incredible amount of trauma. It was almost inevitable. His life story was lined out in front of him, mm-hmm. because of the trauma, mm-hmm. that was there. How do you help him? Yeah. How does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, it's devastating. And to think about for a child who has no control and is so innocent and vulnerable in that situation, and yet exposed to such extreme forms of violence. The problem is that he was probably desensitized. It showed you that he had been exposed to many different forms of violence, and that was commonplace for him in his life. It's shocking to me hearing about people's stories and in the forensic evaluations that I do, people who lived in gang-infested neighborhoods and were parts of within gangs themselves, and in Detroit, and in Tennessee was another place. And it's just shocking to hear. It sounds as though they're living in a war-torn environment, not in the United States. And their experiences and perceptions of the world are very similar to somebody coming out of war, a veteran coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it sounds wild to even consider drawing some kind of a correlation, but the effects on the human psyche are not so different. So with a person like that, how do you teach someone to become more sensitized to life and experiences when they've just learned to detach themselves totally and numb themselves completely? Sometimes they have to relearn how to read scenarios and people and how to relate to people, not necessarily see them as objects, but other thinking, feeling creatures similar to them. And it can be so hard to create that attachment back with people when there's just such a loss and violence and devastation that they learn not to trust those instincts or themselves.
I can imagine that you see a lot of these people in people that you evaluate, whether they are terrorists or people who are involved in capital crimes, who've been engaged in an environment where it was violent from a young age.
You know, I see the turning point in people in their lives when they have a child. So when they have a child, they see a part of themselves and they see that vulnerability and that innocence that was taken away and that it couldn't be preserved. And it was okay, and it was like they had the justification for running amok and engaging in that violence because that's what they knew and grew up with it, and why should they care about what anyone else thinks or feels, because it's just unimportant. But once they have a child, that really starts to disrupt that narrative, if they have any care or concern for that child, because they see themselves in that child. And if they can see themselves in that child, I think that's when I start to see some of these shifts. And for people in jail, that becomes their motivation. I want to get out because I don't want my son growing up like me. And my daughter doesn't even know who I am. And I think of all the women that I abused in my life, and I don't want that happening to her. Right? So now they start to see themselves in a different way as a protector of innocence.
Interesting. So that takes us to kind of the last part, because it takes us to the story that you tell yourself. Again, many cases of trauma you're just not going to fix on your own. There are many cases that you're going to need help and you're going to need guidance from other people. In fact, I think we would even say in our in the hierarchy that we use, the 7 items, it's always important that you reach out for help. It may be help to a mentor, it may be help to a spiritual advisor, it may be help to a psychologist. There are lots of different ways that you can get help. Sometimes you want the best professional that you can helping you, who has a long history of helping other people with trauma and PTSD. But regardless, even if it's not that serious, or you think you can self-medicate, it's always important to find people who will help you internally. I'd like to go through these 7 items and there are things that I use in mentoring people and counseling people and helping people with trauma. But again, I want to stress that I'm certainly not a trauma expert. I'm just good at being able to help mentor people. And these are things that you and I have put together collectively. So I'd like to go through your thoughts on each one of them. You'll find as you look through these, you'll find a worksheet on trauma on theoptimisticamerican.com. But you'll see that they relate pretty close to what was in our book on addictive ideologies, where we talk about the 7 ideals, which was a hierarchy for agency. Now, keep in mind, agency is about the belief that you can determine your destiny, that you believe that the actions that you take and what you do for yourself actually has an effect on the outcome. Your behavior, your psychology determines the environment. The environment doesn't have to determine your psychology. So let's start with the first one, which is in dealing with trauma, is you have to change your story. Now, the changing your story, which by the way relates to our number 1 item on the hierarchy, which is know the truth. But if the story that you have in your head is one where you're a victim, if it's a story of that there's no way out of this, there's probably no way out. If the story that you have is that it's hopeless, it's probably hopeless. If the story that you have is you're sad or you're depressed, you're probably going to be sad or depressed. You have to change that story that you have. Now, I'd love to have your input on that if you could, and help me think about that.
Yeah, and so this is where, as Dr. Asad Bashkailo referred to himself not as a victim of genocide of the Bosnian War, but as a survivor.
A total change in the story.
Yeah, and so language matters. Language matters. What are you telling yourself? How are you defining things? What is your interpretation of the events? You can't change facts. Facts are historical. But you can change what you're telling yourself about it. So rather than seeing yourself as totally powerless in the situation, or maybe you were fleeing a situation in which you would have preferred that you stayed, by looking at, well, what were the mechanisms? You may have not had all that much ability to really stay when your body was telling you flee the situation for survival purposes, and that's the primitive part of the brain that's really taking over. I also see and this can be really hard. It's a little bit of a deviation from what we're talking about right now, but I think would be important just in terms of sexual trauma. So it's really not uncommon for me to see in the forensic work that I do that people who become sex offenders have histories of being sexually victimized themselves. And there's so much research out there to show and demonstrate that if someone's been sexually victimized, that there is a reenactment of what has happened to them. And oftentimes, if it's children, that they'll see that if a child is reenacting something that is overly sexual for what would be appropriate for their age, that might be a sign that they're being sexually victimized. And that's actually something teachers look for, or adults or caregivers or other treatment providers look for as part of the signs or symptoms for intervention. Now, the problem is that there's so much shame to talk about, not just that being a victim of sexual abuse, or even if it's incest. I mean, that's a whole nother layer of shame connected to sexual trauma. But then I also see people who are maybe engaging in viewing of child pornography and not necessarily having any contact with child as a sex offender, but still, it's a very, very serious crime, and yet they want help, but there's really nowhere that they can go if they see that there is this sickness, and they can see that, okay, I know where this is coming from, but yet I don't know how to treat this myself. And so they become a population that is really there aren't a lot of options for people to seek help in that area, because immediately the legal system would be incarcerating them.
So you're going to see that person. By the way, I do think that's right on point. It's on point because the story that we tell ourselves is important, and knowing the truth is important. And if you can't deal with the truth, the story you tell is about knowing the truth, but you can't. If you can't tell the truth, it's almost impossible to fix. And the shame concept
prevents
is
people
really
from
important.
telling
Now,
the
here are
truth.
people that I do deal with. I deal with people who have been incarcerated, who've been in jail. And again, I don't want to give any names, but more than once, I've had a person that have come to me that have asked for help, that wanted to try to figure out how to become an entrepreneur or a business person or a salesperson working inside a company, and they had a criminal record. Now, in some respects, it's actually easier to become an entrepreneur with a criminal record than it is to become an employee, because
Having
people
a felony.
check on employees, and the felony can be harmful to you. But almost always, the advice that I give to people is, you have to start with the truth. And they're so ashamed of what they've done that talking about it becomes very, very difficult. It becomes very difficult for them. Yet, in at least the cases that I'm involved with, and they're not as extreme as yours, but I think yours probably need to go to a psychologist because there's a protection that exists in that environment, or they're already in jail and you're talking to them. But in my world, the issue is it's just shame that's holding them back. And what happens is they'll go and try to sell. And when they go to try to sell the product, they get to know the product. Well, maybe they do all the sales steps well. But if someone finds out they have a criminal record, it's almost immediate that they're going to distrust them. So the way that you can...
If they're hiding it.
If they're hiding it.
If they're not leading with it.
But if they lead with it, I tell most people who've been through this, hey, I would start my sales talk like this after I get into the door. Hey, before I waste your time, I need you to know something. I just spent 5 years in jail, and I spent my time in jail for doing X. Yeah. And whatever my X was, I probably did things that were even worse than that. All right. But I spent my time there. I just don't want you to find out about it from someone else. I understand if that means that you don't trust me and you don't want me to hear about my product. But if you are willing to, I'd love to move forward. But I completely understand if you just would rather cut the meeting short. First, by getting that truth out, it's now off your shoulders. It's on their shoulders. They're now the ones that have to deal with it. Number two, you've actually just taken the most important step in being able to make a deal happen, to create
vulnerability, connection,
and
human
truth
connection.
And trust, right? Truth and trust they're actually words that are connected. You build trust in people by giving them the truth. And when you do that, and when you're willing to take on that shame and vulnerability up front, yeah, you're going to lose some customers. You're going to lose some people who go, no thanks, I'm not going to deal with you. But in my experience, most people are very, very forgiving. And in fact, once you're vulnerable with them, they begin to trust you more and they start to want to help you. Trust in other people's empathy. But to do that, sometimes you have to be willing to be a bit vulnerable yourself.
Yes. Yeah. And that comes with communication, being able to trust yourself that you're going to be able to move through this with grace, even though you're revealing your shame story.
All right, so let's go on to the next item, which is physiological. Physiological is how your physiology begins to affect your thinking, all right, and it affects your trauma response. If you look at physiological, by the way, on our hierarchy, that would relate to be accountable to yourself, that you have some role that you have to play in being accountable to yourself. But your physiology includes a variety of things. One thing that it includes is your workouts, exercise. Another thing that it includes is diet. Now, here's what I want to talk about. There's a great book. It's called Younger Next Year. It's written by a cellular biologist. I read too much, obviously, but it's written by a cellular biologist. And in this book, he talks about what happens neurologically to people when they don't exercise right and when they don't eat enough. And the point that he makes is about a bear. He says a bear actually, when it goes into hibernation, there are hormones that are released in the bear, and it makes them, as they begin to have less food, as they begin to walk less because winter's coming, because there's less food, because there's less places to walk, there's actually a metabolic depression that is self-induced. It's induced into the bear to slow it down, to make it more tired, and to make it more lethargic. Right? Well, there's depression that can come from trauma. Trauma itself can cause depression, but so can the way that you react physiologically. If you decide you're going to not work out, you're going to sit on the couch, that can have an effect on you as to actually metabolically beginning to induce a depression, to slow you down, to make you not feel good, to make you more lethargic. And then what will you do? Well, you'll probably eat worse foods, and at the same time, you will do less exercise. Diet, interestingly enough, can do the same thing. When you go on these crazy diets that don't have a balance inside your food, that aren't getting you the right amount of proteins, the right amount of vegetables, I mean, we all know what we shouldn't do. You can't go on a diet and think you're going to get the right salad at McDonald's. It's probably just not going to happen. You're going to go to McDonald's and you're going to get the cheeseburger. But if you focus on eating the right types of foods and enough of them, it gives you the energy from a metabolic standpoint to be able to go out and do those things that we want to do from an exercise standpoint. But being accountable to yourself includes understanding that your physiology affects your mental capacity.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And some of the symptoms, because oftentimes we see PTSD with major depressive disorder. So we'll see things like withdrawal, isolation, excessive sleeping or less sleep, or extreme weight changes like weight gain or excessive weight loss. A loss of libido, fatigue, a loss of motivation. And that might be classic depression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, interestingly enough, in this book, it talks about, the Younger Next Year book, it talks about that when you are laying around watching TV, it actually reduces the amount of serotonin that your body is releasing. And serotonin regulates all types of things, blood clotting, bone development. It releases, it has an effect on sexual desire, on your desire to be more athletic. So the fact that you are releasing less serotonin actually makes you want those things less, right? And that in itself begins to have a depressive effect.
Self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, it's a vicious cycle and vicious loop.
All right, so now let's talk about the next one, which is asking for help. All right, the importance in trauma to asking for help. And to me, this goes to our strength argument, strength over safety. It's easy for us to put our comfort over our ability to be courageous, right? Courage is necessary to be able to resolve these types of problems. And when you know that you're facing a challenge like trauma, oftentimes you can begin to play out in your mind, hey, I caused the problem. Or you can play out in the problem, well, I must be weak because I couldn't deal with it. Asking for help becomes important. Vulnerability becomes important. Now, again, that can be by going to a psychologist. And in some cases, you have to have a psychologist to help work you through it. But sometimes it can be just getting the right role models and the right mentors who can help give you advice on your way through.
Yeah, you once talked to me about fortitude. And I think that this definitely has a place here. Like having that mental and emotional fortitude. It doesn't just come from nowhere. You have to work at it. Sometimes people's characters definitely have that, but they're also working at it because they're leaning into the challenge. They're not shying away from it. And that makes them stronger.
All right. The next one, we're just going to call it what it is on our hierarchy, which is finding meaning and purpose.
Oh, this is an important one for trauma.
Yeah, the idea that you begin to find a purpose for your life is important. Now, we love Viktor Frankl. I think I've watched everything that he's done. I've read as many of his books as I can.
He's a hero.
He's a hero, right?
Yes.
But what he talked about was free will. That it's up to you, that you actually determine your view of things. And he had this, like he even thought that we shouldn't have in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed upon their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including upon that which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's what he had the issue with.
He hated happiness.
The pursuit of happiness.
Now, I happen to think
he's not
they
like
actually
anti-happy, but he lived a very hard life.
They meant
Holocaust
meaning. But
survivor,
what happiness was actually taken from, interestingly enough, was it used to be before Thomas Jefferson wrote it in those famous words, it was life, liberty, and property, right? But Jefferson looked at that and said, wait a minute. Some people it's property, some people it's art, some people it's music, some people it's their ability to write. And so he called it happiness. So I think he actually kind of meant what Viktor Frankl was thinking. But I think Viktor Frankl was concerned that too many people actually began to interpret it's important for me to be happy.
Yeah,
right?
this
and his answer was
entitlement. I'm deserving of happiness.
Happiness is fleeting.
Yeah.
Look, if somebody you love dies next week, you're going to be sad. You're not going to be happy, nor should you be. Meaning can transcend that.
Yeah, and he was also working with suicidal people. I mean, that was his population as a psychiatrist.
Usually who had some trauma.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for him to trying to be working with, well, you just need to find happiness. No. That's no meaning. You need to find meaning in life, in living.
You know, the problem
What
with that
is-
word is it's so hard to understand. What does that mean, right? And it's like you're looking for a nirvana. Well, if I just dedicated my life like Mother Teresa, I could find my meaning. And the answer is no. You have to find your meaning, not her meaning. So he actually gave us a guideway. He said, look, meaning is found in three things. We believe there are four, but let's just do three real quick.
Can you give an example here before you go into that? I just had a flash memory of when you were talking about, it was somebody that you were working with very well, a mentor of yours when you were the mayor, and he was, I believe, paraplegic. And
Howard Adams.
He said to you, if you think that all you have are your legs, your hands and legs, and that defines who you are, then you're the one who's handicapped.
That's
Will you
exactly
tell
what
that
he
story?
said. Well,
That's a great.
You just did.
Well,
but I'll.
Well, fill in the pieces.
You killed my
missed.
punchline.
Oh, sorry.
But nonetheless, Howard Adams
But it's
was
a perfect
a
example for
quadriplegic,
what we're
and
talking
he was a
about.
beautiful human being.
It was quadriplegic.
We had many differences. There were some people who hated Howard because he was kind of the arch conservative on the council. I loved him, but I loved him because every day this guy came to work happy. And one day I just noted it. I go, Howard, I can't tell you how inspirational you are to me. And he goes, why am I inspirational to you? I said, oh my gosh, you come to work happy every day. He goes, well, don't you? I says, Howard, you suffered a traumatic injury by diving into the water. It caused you to break your back. And as an adult, you lost all functions. I mean, you can barely move your hand to be able to move your wheelchair. And yet you come in happy. I don't know that I could do that. And that's when he gave me that line. He said, Johnson, if you think the only thing you're about is your arms and your legs, you're a lot more handicapped than I am. Right?
That is perfect. That's a perfect example.
It's a perfect example
Yes.
because you have the option of looking at this in the way in which you want to. And that guy was indefatigable. You just couldn't put him down, right? He had learned an inner strength that went way beyond the things that most of us have just grown to expect to be a part of what we should have. But Frankl told us there are three places that you find meaning. The first place that you find it is in the people or things that you love, right? There is meaning in that. You talked about a child a moment ago, but that can be your parents. For that matter, it can be a sunset. All he had, the only joy they were able to find in that being in that work camp after their families had been murdered
Auschwitz and the
in
concentration
Auschwitz
camp.
was to go look at that sunset every night. But to be there, they had to be working. They couldn't even be caught looking at it, right? But they'd look at it, they'd watch it, and they'd watch that last 30 seconds where it would go below the horizon. And then they'd come back into the room and in whispers, they'd talk about it, about how beautiful it was. Did you see the reds and the golds? Did you see the clouds? Did you see how it reflected off of the water? They learned to love that one thing. Now, what was he trying to do? Keep them alive, right? What did that give him?
To look forward
in
to.
suffrage, he found meaning. The other place that you find meaning is in what you create, right? The things that we create, we can find it. Our art, our music, our businesses, the things that we put our time and effort into.
Helping other people.
Helping other people. Now, that to me is the fourth item, right? Because to me, it's number one is who and what you love. Number two, what it is that you create. He then said, suffrage. You can actually find a greater sense of meaning in suffrage than you can without it. And then the fourth one is helping people, helping other people. So let's go to that one because that's one of ours. If you look at the seven hierarchies, you'll find the we, not me, the fact that we belong to something bigger. My favorite story in that was on this show just a few weeks ago. His name was Rick Romley. Rick Romley became became the county attorney in Arizona. He's maybe one of the most honorable people that I ever dealt with. I was a Democrat at the time, and I'm an independent today. I kind of have given up totally on political parties. But he was a Republican, and it didn't matter. He dealt with everybody based upon the law and based upon integrity and ethics. But he went through a horrific incident. When he was in Vietnam, he stepped on an IED, and the IED blew his legs off. He went to the hospital, and when he was in the hospital, he said that he was incredibly depressed. He realized he probably wasn't going to have children anymore. He wasn't going to be able to have a family. His wife, he knew he was going to have problems with, and that she would probably want to move on. And he was incredibly depressed and ready to give up on life. He says, I thought that I wanted to die. He says, and on top of all that was this immense pain, this pain that just made you want more morphine. He says, maybe so much morphine that you wouldn't have to worry about going on to the next day. But he said what saved him was that some young guy came in who was of a lower rank than him, who had the same thing that had happened. And he said he literally got on his wheelchair, went over to him because the guy was all night long just screaming he wanted to die. Please, God, let me die. And he said, and I made it my job to convince him he needed to live. Right? Sometimes we find our meaning in finding other people who have problems that are worse than ours, or maybe problems that are just like ours, and helping them, saving them. That's why I connect it to meaning. But it's really about belonging and the fact that you belong to something bigger.
Yeah, and in that moment, he was connecting with him. I mean, he was suffering from the same injuries and the same shock and horror and the same changes to his future and the losses to his future. But yet he was able to move outside of his own self-pity when he was seeing how can I help this other person? And I think that is such a powerful opportunity if people can find it, how they can maybe give back to community or give back through mentorship or give back through assisting other vulnerable people who are on the same journey as them, but maybe in a different position. And I think it helps. I really do. I see a lot of this in the work that I do. And it may take a toll and may take something from them, but yet it just moves them temporarily out of their own suffering when they're really focusing on helping another.
All right, so I'm going to go to the controversial item last. I'm going to skip over one item, which was gratitude, but we're already kind of coming on the hour, so I'd like to shorten this. And interestingly enough, the one in psychology when it comes to trauma that is a little more controversial.
I know where you're going with this, forgiveness. Yes. We just keep coming back to it.
Is love and connection, or love and forgiveness.
Love and forgiveness.
Now, I'll give you my point of view first, and then you can give your counter. And then unlike our personal relationship, I get the last word, and then I'll close
fine.
this thing up.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
I will let you have the last word.
That's what I like about you. I'm in charge as long as you let me be in charge. All right, so here's here's my point. And I've dealt with some trauma in my life, although I can tell you after watching. I grew up in a pretty poor neighborhood. A lot of the kids that I had, my top 5 friends died brutal deaths growing up, drug deals, burglaries that went wrong where they were the burglar. I mean, they were kids who were highly problematic. I was fortunate that I had a mother and a father who, even though it wasn't the greatest neighborhood, they really made certain that they put time on the 9 of us and the attention that we needed. My dad would pick us up and take us to work every day as soon as we got out of school. However, the single most important thing that I found to be able to deal with trauma is forgiveness. I love Martin Luther King, as you know, and Martin Luther King, I look at what happened to the Black community in the South, for that matter, throughout the entire country. I mean, slavery was allowed. It was an abomination, obviously, to any sense of morality that we might have. Even after slavery was done, the Jim Crow laws that took place, the the terrorism that took place by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the having to sit on the back of the bus. It was traumatic, it was horrific, and it's almost not excusable. And yet there was this guy who provided light, right? And he was talking to people about love. And the love that he was talking about, he was obviously a Christian minister, but I know you're Jewish, but he spoke to everyone. In fact, there was a huge Jewish community that was involved in his movement. Yeah. And his message was that there are different types of love. There's the type of romantic love that exists. It's important. There's the type of love that comes from brotherly love, philia, like Philadelphia. But then there was also this agape, this idea that you could love not only people you didn't know, but you could love your enemies. That didn't mean that you're going to go hang out with them at a bar. But forgiveness was an important part of that. And he knew the message that he believed in spiritually was maybe the most important thing that had happened that made his religion was what it was this guy who was being put up on a cross, who had been tortured, humiliated, brutalized, who the last words he said was, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I think that's a secret. I know in my own life the ability to not harbor the anxiety and the anger and the hatred towards other people, that it works. I've listened to people over and again where this became a solution. John McCain, I
was going to say, I'm like, you have to tell the John McCain story.
I mean, John McCain, the story's so powerful. He's put into a cell that he can't even stand up in. His arms are broken. There are other prisoners being tortured, some of which are dying. He went through a horrific event by people who brutalized him. Near the end of his life, under the Clinton administration, he went back to Vietnam. He met with those people who had brutalized him, and he forgave them. That story is told over and again, and we forgive not because it helps the other person. It's not about the other person. It's about letting go, letting go of what happened.
That part I agree with you with, on the letting go part. And I think that it can be different for different people. And this is probably where I differ with you the most, because it can be shaming to a person to say, hey, that all that sexual violence and sexual abuse that you experienced by that perpetrator or family member or neighbor or coach, you just need to forgive them, and that's going to help heal you. And if they don't do that, that there's maybe the shaming that happens. And so I don't want people to walk away hearing that version of what it is that you're saying. I think there's absolute merit in what you're saying, but I also think that there's individual differences in what people can find for themselves, and they get to create their own healing journey and story. And it's going to be different for different people. And so forgiveness, there is actually a lot of research on letting go. That forgiveness is about that personal, individualistic process on letting go. What is it that you need to let go of that may or may not even involve the other person? I do a lot of interventions that are experiential in the therapy room, where we bring in the perpetrator and we have a conversation with the perpetrator, or we bring in the child and we have a conversation with the inner child, and we help heal the inner child. So there's a lot of things that we can do that don't actually have to physically involve confrontation with one's perpetrator, and it does promote healing. It does, because again, it changes that narrative, it changes that interpretation of the events. And once they can find that letting go and find that peace and solace within themselves, that's what's going to help somebody move forward. So we're not advocating for everyone to confront their perpetrator or to forgive their perpetrator face to face. I think it's really remarkable that John McCain did that, but it can be different for different people.
All right. Well, other than saying that I definitely lean more towards the importance of forgiveness, I'm going to let you have had the last word. That was a great summary. And maybe one day we'll do a show on restorative justice, because I think both of us have seen countries, specifically Rwanda, where restorative justice could be a very, very powerful tool, at least one that we should have in our arsenal. All right, so again, Emily, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our guests for being here today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of The Optimistic American. And if you like what it is that you heard, please make certain you push that subscribe button. It really does make a difference for us, and it helps make you a part of the team. It helps make you part of the group that we will include as part of the ongoing conversation. Thank you.